Our first keynote speaker is Professor Dorothy Bischop. Welcome. Until recently, she was Professor of Developmental Neuropsychology at the University of Oxford. She is an honorary fellow of St. John's College there. But beyond psychology, she's been a champion of open science and reproducibility for years. She was the inaugural chair of the advisory board of the UK Reproducibility Network and a founding member of the reproducibility branch in Oxford of that same network. She is also active on social media. If you haven't seen it before, make sure you check out her extremely impressive blog, Bishop blog, or follow her on Twitter. She tweets as DVB. She's going to talk to us today about the importance of research integrity in a changing scientific world. So, Professor Bischop, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much. It's a real delight to be here online, but it would have been more of a delight to be in person. I really had hoped to come to Amsterdam, but alas, I think the pandemic situation is still such as to make it not a wise decision for somebody from the UK. I'm delighted to have been asked to give a keynote. I'm not really a meta-scientist as such, but as you just heard, I'm more of a sort of jobbing researcher, but with a keen interest in all of these matters. And I just wanted to share with you some of my thoughts, so I will just try and share my screen. And I hope that now my screen is fully visible. Somebody will shout if it's not. So I have indeed put a link to my blog and its catalogue, because so many of the ideas I'm going to talk about here are ones that have sort of gradually grown up over the years. I have been blogging about this general sort of area since about 2010. And I mainly blog when I get irritated by something. And so that's a sort of succession of my letting off my steam on the blog over the years. I want to start, though, by I hope I'm going to shock you by something if you haven't already heard about it. And that is, here's an article that occurred in a journal called Computational Intelligence, which is a Wiley journal, and it was focused on diagnosing Parkinson's disease remotely via AI, so artificial intelligence, gathering data about somebody's speech and then seeing if you could diagnose Parkinson's on that basis. As somebody who has some sort of interest in this area, this already seems to me a somewhat unlikely to succeed project. But the real striking thing about this project was that it was picked up, or the paper was picked up, by an app that is designed to identify papers with things called tortured phrases in them. And these tortured phrases, which you see here, if you look at the right-hand column and you're a statistician, you'll find it a bit weird if a paper talks, instead of about p-values, it talks about p-esteem, or the mean squared error is talked about as the squared mistake, or sometimes the squared blunder. And some of these get quite funny. I mean, feed-forward mechanisms and nourish-forward mechanisms. If one was translating from another language, this might be perhaps understandable, but these are people who are writing in English, and the phrases have got the original phrases, which have gone funny, have got very clear and well-known meanings. And so the general view is that what we tend to see when we see things like this is that you're looking at a paper that's actually plagiarized, produced by usually cobbling together a whole load of other papers that are in the literature rather than just a single source. But in order to mask plagiarism, what you have to do is to change some of the words so that you don't get picked up by plagiarism detectors. And you can do that. There is a special program you can run your script through, your text through, and it will make changes according to a thesaurus, except that it runs into trouble when it hits these sort of things that have got highly technical meanings and very well-known meanings, but which it just glibly translates. And to have Parkinson's disease talked variously about as an ailment, an infection, a malady and a sickness is clearly something's horribly wrong. And the people writing the paper, anybody who knew about that condition would not begin to use those sorts of terms. Now, this is just one example, and perhaps one of the more amusing types of examples that you get of outputs of what are now known as paper mills, and which have really only been discovered relatively recently in the past few years. And these authors of this tortured phrases paper have been at the forefront of finding these sorts of things. But there's also other types of paper mills, which have been described in this Nature piece, talking about fake paper factories that churn out sham science. And quite often what you have are papers that are written according to some sort of template with just a key detail change. Jennifer Byrne, in particular in Australia, discovered these. She was a biomedical scientist working on nucleotide sequences, and she just kept finding very weird nucleotide sequences that didn't bear any relation to what was described in the text, and found that you could have a whole series of papers that had the same basic structure, often the same figures in them, with wrong nucleotide sequences. Elizabeth Bick is well known amongst those of you who are on social media as somebody who's also found figures that are clearly indicative of something being faked because they've been photoshopped. Things, the same figure might be used in a number of different papers. And so you have this problem that you have clear evidence of papers that are just invented. Why are they invented? Well, they're invented because quite often people need a publication in a journal, in an index journal, in order to advance in their career. And I was last week at a meeting that was organized in Munich, and one of the speakers, Bernhard Sabel, who has really focused on this quite heavily in his own research, had said that he had found pricing for these sorts of paper mills. This was a Chinese website where, depending on the impact factor of the journal you wanted to place your paper in, and depending on how much you wanted them to do, whether it included generation of so-called experimental data, as well as just writing, say, a review, you could pay more or less anything from 1,000 to 26,000 euros. And the interesting point here is that this is really big business. There's clearly a market, and this is not rare. The numbers of these papers that are being discovered are very large, and in some cases there have been mass retractions of them. This clearly indicates that something is very, very wrong. But I think there's been a sort of general relaxed attitude towards this by many of us in rich Western countries, because the view is that most paper mills, it is true, have been found operating out of India and China. And in particular in China, it's now been accepted that part of the problem is that if particularly you're a medical doctor and you want to work in a hospital, you have to have a publication in a journal of a certain impact factor, whether you're interested in research or not. And so clearly there is a strong incentive for people to buy these faked papers in order to advance their careers. But I think people have tended to think, well, this is a weird thing. It's certainly far more, there's a lot more of it than we thought. And the publishers are certainly worried when they start finding these coming into their journals. But the general belief is, well, it doesn't really affect us. It's a bit of a strange thing that these other countries do, but the rates of outright fraud are really very low, and overall science is self-correcting. Now, what I want to argue is the reason I'm showing you this is I think that's far too complacent. And although I don't think we have paper mills operating so much in the sorts of science that we do in Europe and North America, I think we have equally corrupting influences. And if anything, it's worse because it can be harder to detect what's going on. Here's an example of self-correction in science occurring, but occurring incredibly slowly. And I would like to see more case histories of this kind being done, because I think this is really indicative of why it's a real indicator of the problem that we have. So this was published in 2019. It was a paper that talked about candidate genes and gene by environment interaction for depression. And it was using a number of really huge samples, including the UK Biobank, to look for associations. And indeed, what it basically found was pretty much nothing. Now, this was shocking to a lot of people because there's been a huge amount of research on this topic, and people widely believed that there was some truth in this matter. In particular, serotonin transporter genes had been, most people thought there was definitely some evidence for a link. And if you look at how much money has been spent on this research over the years, it is horrendous. So what we have here, I just pulled these data off something called NIH Reporter, which is in the US, a website which gives you all the funding that has been awarded, and you can search by keywords. So I just looked for serotonin and gene and depression. And I came up that there had been a total of 1,000 million. So I guess depends whether you're British or American. I think it's coming to 1 billion spent since 1985. And you can see the impact of some highly influential papers that appeared in so-called top journals in Science and in Nature Neuroscience, after which there was a great boost in this line of research. And yet, this doesn't replicate. So we're seeing people trying to build on earlier research and more money being spent seeking results. Quite often people then say, well, it's not quite what was originally found, it's a little bit different. And you get this sort of forking paths phenomenon whereby people go down different sort of pathways, looking not just for main effects, but interactions and so on. But this to me is a symptomatic of what is wrong with our science, that, okay, it's understandable, we might go down some false pathways and need to correct our course, but it seems to me that we're not correcting fast enough, and that this is a fairly standard story, that these things can go on for literally decades. Now, I'm not claiming that those studies on depression were fraudulent, but they were overhyped. And that's just one example. It arises because of inadequate attention to negative findings and failure to replicate the basic finding that you're trying to build on. Or to say you're replicating when in fact you're slightly moving the goalposts, you're changing the nature of the measurements, you're changing the nature of the analysis. And our lack of interest in actually ensuring that what we're building on is solid has led to enormous amounts of waste. And partly that comes down to a quest for novelty and always insisting that every new study has to be novel and that replication is boring. Now, I want to argue provocatively that the mechanisms that allow such overhyped science to thrive are really the same as those that foster paper mills. They have to do with the incentives that we have in the field, which are not aligned with doing solid, good science. There's a nice paper on this that is much more detailed than anything I'm going to say, by Edwards and Roy, published in 2017, which takes you through all the so-called perverse incentives and hyper competition that there is in science. And they have a big table of a set of incentives, what the incentive was intended to achieve, and what it actually achieved. And I'm just going to focus on 3 of those, but they have a number of these. And I've reworded this a bit, but this is the basic message. And of course, the first one is this business where you're just being rewarded for the number of publications. And like most things that people try, this would originally have been done to try to motivate people to be productive, and to some extent as well to ensure accountability. If somebody's employed to do research, well, they should be doing research and they need to demonstrate that. And it's turned into a sort of performance management tool to some extent, but it's seen as relatively objective. If you say, well, how much have you published? That's at least something you can objectively count. It doesn't require you to use any sort of judgment. But of course, the actual effect is this avalanche of substandard papers, and quite often an avalanche of fraudulent papers, as in the case of the paper mills. It sort of follows directly that if you reward people for publishing as much as possible, people will publish a lot of papers, but they're not necessarily good papers. There's some national variations in how this works. In most countries, I think, again, in the West, in Europe and North America, I think it's relatively uncommon for somebody to just have to get a large number of publications, but there is nevertheless an expectation increasingly early on in your career that you'll have some publications. And I found in Oxford, when we were interviewing people for a master's in neuroscience course, I was a bit shocked at how many of the people applying, who were coming from all over the world, already had a publication as an undergraduate. And this was generally regarded as a good thing, a sign that they were a good student. Whereas to me, it was a bit sort of, are we really going to say that we want our undergraduates to have publications? It seemed to me, again, creating the wrong sorts of pressures before they'd even learned how to do anything. They were supposed to be producing publications. And certainly I'm aware that in some European countries, you have to have a certain number of publications in order to graduate with a doctorate. Again, I think this is not a good idea. We don't have that certainly in my university, and I think most British universities don't require that. But there is an expectation that you've produced something that could be published. It's a different thing. But because early on there was recognition that if you just count the number of publications, you can run into trouble with exactly this sort of problem of people churning out a load of not very interesting or even not very accurate stuff. We really moved to say, well, is there a way we could get at research quality rather than just quantity? And the way that tended to emerge was that people looked at citations, because they took the view that if a research is any good, somebody else will cite it. And so this way you would encourage people to do research that had impact rather than just lots of papers. The trouble is, then how do you define that impact? And again, you want something objective. So people have typically used one of two measures. They either have counted a person's citations to their work, or the journal that they publish in has to be one that is highly cited and so has a high journal impact factor. The problem with counting the citations themselves is that there is a long lag between somebody publishing something and the work getting cited. And so if you want a more immediate score, you can just say, well, this must be a good paper because it appeared in a high impact factor journal. Of course, this is also problematic. And just this morning, I substituted this slide for another one I was going to use, because it just sort of captures the frustration that we all have with this. It's that if you want to get cited a lot, you hype your findings, you exaggerate the evidence, and you do well in terms of funding and prestige. And you're supposed to be transparent and honest, but that's not the way to get highly cited work. And he's just saying, he's just read another slew of papers in prestigious journals. Data was ignored and abused to support a novel positive finding. And these are the high impact journals. They really only want this very novel overhyped stuff. And journal impact factor has been recognized for a long time as problematic, because you're not really evaluating the research itself. You're evaluating the company it keeps with other papers. And the distribution that leads to a journal impact factor is highly skewed. So most of a journal's impact factor is coming from a small number of papers with a very large number of citations, so they're in that long tail of the distribution. And so it's not really telling you much. And indeed, it's been argued that high impact journals also have high retraction rates. And so it's really not a good proxy for quality of the work, but that's how it has been used. And there has been backlash now against that, with the Declaration of Research Assessment and the San Francisco Declaration being accepted by many people, arguing this is not a good thing. But it still lingers on in many evaluations of scientists. The other thing to bear in mind is that citations can be gamed and manipulated. Here was a chap who managed to get himself loads of citations because he was a journal editor, and every time he accepted a paper, he suggested that the authors should add a few of his citations, and most of them were to his work. Before we knew where we were, he had this vast number of citations. He was picked up for doing that eventually and fired, but this is the sort of thing that people can do. Indeed, Cyril Labbe, who we've already heard about in the paper mill example, invented a researcher called ANTKARE, and just generated a load of fictitious papers. He'd written something called SciGen, which is one of these things that will generate what look like plausible papers that are actually nonsense. And he generated 100 papers authored by this guy, and they all cited each other. And so on Google Scholar, at any rate, he ended up with a really massive H index that exceeded that of Einstein. So, and he points out, he did this to demonstrate how weak the reviewing is for many of the places where these papers were published. But the point he made is that anybody could actually do this themselves, and I'm sure there are people that do. So we have those two really bad incentives that are just distorting what gets published. I think the thing that's been given less attention, but which I'm most exercised about, is using grant funding as a proxy for research quality. So if you appoint somebody in a university to a position where you want research done and you want your university to be glorious in research, it follows that it makes sense for you to want them to produce, to have some grant income and to show that they can do that. It generates overheads for your institution. And the idea is that this is going to reward the best researchers, the most successful researchers. But this is really pernicious, because what this has led to is a situation where there's a cynical applications for funding. People don't really have a particular research project that they're keen to do. There's no critical question, but they just know they have to submit a grant proposal. And so in it goes. The funding agencies become overwhelmed with applications. And then you even get some people who their status is so dependent on having grants that they start hoarding them, and they learn the tricks for how to get a grant, and they get loads and loads of them, far more than anybody needs. It's just like the worst excesses of capitalism, where somebody hoards all the money, that even whether they need it or not, because somehow they get addicted to having all this symbolic wealth that makes people think they're important. So what you tend to get is a situation where, as the income to the institution increases with the amount of funding, people tend to think, well, it's better to have a big grant than a small grant. It's better to have certainly an expensive grant. So I think probably many of us will be aware of instances where administrators have encouraged people to add things to a grant to make it more expensive. And it's thought that many grants are better than one grant, even though typically, if you want research well done, it does need somebody somewhere to sit down and put the hours into thinking about the problem and actually doing the research. And if you're a PI with a huge number of grants, unless you've got a very good second in command, it's likely that the work won't be properly overseen and evaluated and thought about. So this is really counterproductive. It also is the case that the amount of funding to do research is not a proxy for the value of that research. So there are some activities that are intrinsically more expensive than others, and it just doesn't make sense to disfavor research areas that cost less. If you do that, you would actually, for example, it's quite common for Nobel laureates to go around saying, these days I wouldn't be able to get funded, I wouldn't be able to be employed because I wouldn't bring enough grants. Einstein would be a classic case, because most of what he did, he just needed a piece of paper and a pencil to do it. And there are other mathematicians in that situation. There are some psychologists that do very low-cost research, of whom Daniel Kahneman, Nobel laureate in economics, would have been an example. Be interesting to see whether these days his CV would be sufficient, without the Nobel Prize on it, to get him tenure, because the work he did was very cheap. He just needed small numbers of people to run quite simple experiments. It didn't have a huge amount of apparatus costs or computational costs or anything. So you could be really prejudicing your system against people like this. The other thing is that because there is such a scramble for research funds, researchers get overcommitted. You get poorly conducted studies. And I've also got into the habit of saying to people, think about this interesting problem. If you're a researcher and you were today to just stop having any new funds coming in, and the rest of you would just be able to focus purely on writing up your existing backlog of data. And you don't have to write it all up. Some of it might not be worth writing up, but how long would it take you to write up everything that you'd really quite like to write up that you've done? And I have to tell you, the typical estimate, depending on career stage, is anything from 3 to 10 years. People have a lot of stuff that they've done that never gets published because they haven't got the time, and because the research team moves on, and because the pressure is on to write the next grant, rather than focusing on writing up what you've already done. So there's a number of people in the UK who have some years have been arguing against the idea of using raw grant income as a performance target. Philip Moriarty is a physicist in Nottingham who gets quite exercised on this, and talks about it as encouraging, incentivizing academics to rip off the taxpayer, in the sense that you're applying for public funding and you're being incentivized to apply for as much as possible rather than as much as you need. Now, in this context, the USA, I think, is in a league of its own, and I think it is particularly bad, the way it operates, because unless you're funded by certain sort of independent institutions, like the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, very often you need to have grants in order to get your full salary. And I remember when I first discovered this, I was amazed that this went on, and it seemed to me absolutely unfair and very sort of against all the best principles of employment. But what it leads to is people feeling that if they don't publish or if they don't get grants, then they're going to not have money to eat, in the sense as it's very cogently put here by this person, Stephen Quaid, writing about it in the New York Times. So there, the incentivization is not that dissimilar at all, I think, from what we're seeing with the paper mills and the Chinese idea that in order to get on, you have to have a publication. Here, in order to not just get on, but to survive in a job and to keep your research team, you have to keep bringing in grants. And with no let-up, you're on a treadmill. So what can be done about it? Well, I know this meeting is more or less for moaning about the problems than for saying what can be done. And I've not left very long to talk about it because I'm assuming most people will be talking about solutions. But I think I have particular ideas on this, as I do on most things. Boris Barber wrote a very nice piece back in 2019 on his blog, who just was arguing for much less frequent evaluation, saying you just don't need to keep evaluating people. We've got obsessed with doing this, partly because we feel we need to be accountable, but it really interferes with the process of doing research. And he had some specific questions when you do evaluate that he thought you should ask. What's the best work that somebody's done? So you don't give them everything you've ever done, you pick out the best. And that is quite common now, certainly in the UK, with funders asking for like the top N papers rather than all your papers. What's the worst work, he also suggests you should look at? And you should actually disprefer people who are doing a lot of rubbishy work in the sense of trivial, not in sense of not getting positive results.
Professor Bischop, can I briefly interrupt you? We have about 4 minutes in total for the rest of the session. So we want to know what we can do, but really quickly.
Yeah, okay. And so you ask if work replicates, and I think I've only got a couple more slides. So I'll skip that one, but I will also say the other thing is I think we should be considering bang for your buck rather than amount of grant income. So we should be saying that resources and power should be seen as opportunities rather than that they are just a reward that you've got. My most radical suggestion is that we should debar organisations that set specific funding goals for their staff from getting funding from the big funders. And if they did that, that would transform things. But that's a solution for funders, not for institutions. So academics need money, a supportive environment and time. Hyper competition for funds means that everybody's writing grant proposals and the funding periods really are too short for people to have time to think or develop ideas. And so the bottom line, for my mind, is that you need to make sure your researchers are happy and are supportive and are not under continual pressure of being evaluated. If there were institutional rankings for staff satisfaction, how would you fare in your institution? If the answer is not well, if you've got unhappy staff, then I would say think again, because you're not making good use of what is your most precious resource, your staff. You're creating incentives for poor quality research, and you're also damaging a reputation and deterring excellent staff from coming to work at your institution. And that's it. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Professor Bischop. So we have time for a few quick questions. So there's one from our online audience, Bart Penders. He asks, should we ask research funders to not promote their funding decisions publicly? So just award the money in silence. Do you think that might help?
I don't see why. No, not really. I don't see what the purpose of that would be. I might be missing the point of the question. I mean, it would mean, I suppose, that people couldn't say, oh, I've had a big grant, isn't that wonderful? But I mean, you would still know because people would have to use the money and appoint people on the basis. So I'm not sure that in itself would help. I mean, I suppose I'm more radical. I mean, I do think that the funders should be just changing the sorts of things that they do fund rather than how they talk about it.
Fair enough, thank you. If anyone here in the audience has a question, we can squeeze it in. Lex Bouter, go ahead.
Yeah, well, thank you for this really, really intriguing talk and your inspiring talk as well. My brief question is, you seem to be in favor of removing perverse incentives, which would be a great thing. But do you know any inspirational examples of that? Because many institutions and many scientists are nowadays struggling to find the magic bullet to remove perverse incentives. Do you have some inspirational examples? And that may help you to squeeze in some of this information on the slides you had to skip.
I think in the UK, the Wellcome Trust, who have funded me for some years, have really tried to engage with this and have gone quite a long way. They've always been slightly ahead of the curve. And they were amongst the institutions, for example, that started to say, we're not when you apply for funding, you don't put in all your CV and all your publications. We want to just know about your best 4 or 5. So that in itself already sort of, gives people the sense that what we want is your best work. And if you divide it up into loads and loads of little publications, that's not going to go any further. They've also recently started they had a big survey of research culture, and they've been emphasizing the importance of research communities and collaborative research rather than this hyper-competitive environment. So I think that it's worth looking on their website at the sorts of initiatives that they're taking forward. But the nice thing is they have been doing them in consultation. So they've started by sort of just gathering views and asking scientists what are the problems and what needs fixing, and then they're trying to come up with solutions. So I'm hugely impressed with them, even though I have to say the last time I tried to get money from them, I was turned down. So it's not just that they give me money that I like them, but I think that their way of working is that they have the freedom as a non-governmental organisation to be a little bit more innovative. And I think our other major funders are to some extent following their lead, but I would say that's the best example I can give.
All right. Professor Bischop, thank you so much. This was a bleak picture you painted, but also a realistic picture. But fortunately, you didn't leave us in the lurch and also gave us some ideas for how to improve things. So thank you so much, and we look forward to exchanging further thoughts with you later on in the panel. Thanks.